Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asid Lalji. Welcome to the next live session of Avid Online. And for those joining us for the first time, a special welcome. Please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning and our partners for this evening. Avid Online was launched on the 1st of April 2020 in direct response to the pandemic. So now we're almost 16 months young and over 270 programs later, we can say that although 2020 and most of 2021 has challenged us in unprecedented ways, we managed to stay positive, relevant, engaged, and engaging. We continue to champion and bring to our audiences the best of the arts and culture, staying true to our mantra, as always, that learning never stops. Museums have today become far more than a repository of artifacts and forgotten histories. They are archives, places of research and reflection, and have become cradles for future development, incorporating the best of science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics to encourage and explore critical thinking, provoke deeper reasoning, and ensure an enthralling experience for the visitors. Avid has collaborated with several traditional and online museums, including the CSMVS, the NGMA, Museocamera, and Sarmaya, to name a few. We're keen to explore what comes next for museums and cultural spaces beyond 2021. Our partners for the evening, the Federation of the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI, the Creative Industries Division that I'm also honored to be a part of, is doing some important work in this space. So we were actually supposed to have the Secretary General do a few opening remarks, but he'll probably join us later in the conversation. So that brings me to our evening session, Museums 2021, Cultural Meaning and Digitizing Legacy, a discussion on the changing role of these institutions and cultural sites. Please allow me to give a warm virtual welcome and introduce our eminent speakers for this evening. Founder, Sarmaya Arts Foundation, Paul Abraham. Filmmaker, producer, archivist, and founder director of Film Heritage Foundation, Shivendra Singh Dungarpur. Managing Director, Teamwork Arts, Sanjoy Roy. Designer, curator, and founder of Mode, Museum of Design Excellence, Divya Thakur. They will be in conversation with our moderator for this evening, Deputy Editor, Live History India and Curator, Aparna Andhare. For more about each of our speakers, please refer to their impressive bios that have been posted in the chat section. This discussion was originally planned in May to celebrate International Museums Day, but we rescheduled it because of the second wave. This panel will now probe what the museums has and will come to signify in a post-pandemic world. Please note the session will last 75 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A, in which Aparna will be taking questions submitted. So please start posting them in the Q&A box throughout. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Aparna, to level set and your opening remarks, and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asad. Thank you very much to all of you for being here and everyone who's dragged themselves to the virtual world for one more Zoom session. I'm very impressed that people are actually coming, and Asad, that's credit to you, because Avid has these fantastic sessions that keep me online 24/7 just now. So thank you. It's always very, very interesting to talk about museums. And as a museum professional, we can talk about them endlessly. We talk about museum roles, we talk about what we should do, gossip about who's collecting what, programs that are happening around. But the last couple of years have, of course, been very, very difficult. Several museums, without anticipating for how long we'd be locked out, had to stay away from collections. Programs that were planned for years in advance suddenly stalled, and several things went wrong. The last couple of months, and the last few weeks at least, have just turned out to be another set of nightmares. And I'm going to start on a slightly somber note, but I promise that there is hope at the end, as our panelists will tell you today. So we begin this story, of course, with this very disturbing tweet I caught. And if you're on Twitter, museum Twitter is such a vibrant space just now, as is museum Instagram. But on 15th of August, this was a press release that the National Museum of Afghanistan put online on Twitter. Of course, they were talking, we were very worried, and everyone's been worried about what's going to happen to a country in absolute chaos. And then several people in the museum sector, including organizations like ECOMOS, responded by saying, with statements and with ideas as to how we can protect heritage. Museums now, I think, also have a very, very strong response, a serious responsibility towards collecting responsibly. We are anticipating that the art market will be flooded by antiquities that were looted from various places, and these need to then be addressed. And perhaps as a community, we need to come together to make sure that places like Afghanistan, like several other places like Syria, places do not lose heritage which belongs to everyone to these political upheavals. Having said that, when the lockdown happened, and now to slightly happier stories, when lockdown happened, people came up online, and suddenly, almost overnight, everyone's museum online presence, which used to be Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, extremely interactive, completely up their game. Curators who didn't have access to their collection tapped into several different platforms online and then created Spotify lists. This is the Bhaudaji lads social media, which completely took the internet by storm, bringing both a ray of sunshine and space to have conversations. They also dipped into their archives with Tuesday Talks, where lectures were posted on YouTube, and made sure that their internet presence was interactive. If so far museums were using, or Indian museums especially, were using online platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram to draw in visitors, suddenly footfalls didn't matter, but an engagement did. It also meant that we needed to interpret objects very, very carefully and in lucid terms, so that everyone would begin to engage and enjoy them. Memories became a big part, and of course there were global trends and global events that everyone participated in. Lots of museums, lots of art and culture organizations, but Bhaudaji did a stellar job. We also suddenly saw small and large museums take to the virtual world with virtual tours. MAP has been flooding YouTube and Instagram with extremely well curated and well produced content, but smaller museums too, like the Raja Dinkar Kelkar Museum in Pune, came up with 3D virtual tours. Just because we were stuck at home didn't mean that we couldn't go to a museum. In fact, I think I've taken more virtual tours or more museum tours in the last year or so than I have in my entire life. But this was an excellent way to sort of look at these objects, to see displays, to see galleries, and then to also figure out what are digitization strategies, what are the objects that you put on, what are display methods, and how can we use technology that's available to create beautiful content. Biennales happened, and they were extremely difficult, I'm sure, to organize, but also very engaging, with people joining in from all over the world. If there was an upside to being online all the time, it's one was that we weren't restricted by being able to get to a certain place or by scholars, and we had an entire range of people coming to the virtual sphere, as we do just now, and have biennales. So this was another a very interesting experiment that happened, and a very successful one too. We need to, I suppose, in the next couple of years, relook at theories and relook at how histories are being written. When No Touching, No Spitting, No Praying was edited by Saloni Mathur and Kavita Singh, has a series of essays that are talking about museums. It's now time for us to also think about, what are we doing now? How have we tackled the pandemic? What are we doing now? And where are we going to head from here? With that, a very, very breathless, I'm afraid, sort of introduction, what we'll do this evening is we'll talk to our panelists about their own practice. Each of them occupy the museum sphere in very different ways. They're all online, but they're also shaping the way museums and the world functions. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and take a deep breath for one, and then ask Divya to unmute herself. And Divya, if we could start you off. There you go. Hi. Thank you for joining us. You're in a very beautiful location.
Yes.
But Divya, when you started Mode, you always knew that you wanted to occupy the physical space. But Mode came from an engagement, occupy a virtual space, but it came from an engagement with a physical space and buildings. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. We came up with Mode well before the pandemic hit, and I've been sold on the idea of a virtual museum well before the world has turned around on its head. And the advantages, as we know, are that the reach is massive. You can reach anyone in any corner of the world with basic bandwidth. And that's been fantastic, obviously, and that's the first reason for us to be there. Over and above that, we always wanted to have, to be able to tell India's stories. And I found that there wasn't any repository for that, India's design stories in particular. And so therefore, I landed up founding the Museum of Design Excellence. And at that time, I think we were the only person in the digital space. And when I say digital or virtual, I don't mean something that has a virtual arm, but I really mean that this was the structure of the museum. We deliberately said that we'd rather not put money down on constructing a building and putting all of that, and really create something which concentrates on the content. Right. And so it was really about building content. Yeah.
What role does design then play? Because you've curated and created these fantastic exhibitions in India and abroad. When you're looking at a virtual exhibition or making something for just the online world, as a designer, what goes through your mind?
So I think that has shifted. Had we asked someone this question 2 years ago, every museum was thinking about having digital presence. Mm-hmm. And that digital presence typically meant taking something you already had and just giving it a digital presence by way of a photograph or a caption or something like that. But when you actually design a exhibit in the virtual space, your medium is your message. It needs to completely turn around to suit the medium. And so therefore, the way you construct your content, your research is pretty much the same. You need to put in as much work on research. Right. But the way you construct your content, the way you put it across, the language, the amount of the words, your choice of words, the keywords, I think you have to be a lot more specific and a lot more judicious. You don't have the time for someone to just amble in and amble out. They come in, if you lose them, they're gone. Yes. So you have to be very careful. Your visual content has to be extremely arresting. So I could put it down to 4 or 5 things. I would say very carefully look at the content, look at the pitch that you're going to take, because the pitch virtually needs to be something that occupies something that hasn't been said before. So the pitch is extremely important. The visual factor is extremely important. How the image is experienced, or how an object is experienced in third dimension or through a conversation. We have to think a lot about the visual aspect while designing for the virtual medium. And we have to do what we'd call in the Google Arts and Culture space, keywords. So you have very few words to say what you want to say. So for example, we did an exhibit at the CSMVS, and it was on the seating design in India. But when 2 years later, when I set up Mode and I put it up on Google Arts and Culture, we changed the heading goes to Beyond the Throne, because that's the cliche. That's what people around the world think, that India's past with seating design is just the throne. So right. That is why we sort of, had to go out there and really hit it and say Beyond the Throne, India's history of seating design. So the keywords: point of view, And obviously content I've already put out. And I think that while you can correct what you put online, it's going to live on. It's not a show that is, mounts and then dismounts. It's going to be there.
So
For
there's
as long
nothing
as you like to have
ephemeral
it.
then about.
Yes, exactly. So it's important to have. It's important while you design to have something that is good enough to pull someone in, but also good enough to live on. Because typically we're all busy thinking new things, and so something that's been done, it just stays there. Yeah. So I think those 5 things: engagement being the key, of course. That's
so there are lots of hashtags that are floating around then. But when you did this, when the show happened at CSMBS, did you simultaneously plan the virtual? Did you know?
No, not at all. We were keen on doing the virtual at that point, but we couldn't connect the two to happen simultaneously at all. Which, in retrospect, is a brilliant thing, because we did our research and we did the CSMBS show, which was, again, it was a show like that hadn't been done, and it was really, really well received. As a design show, and we had people from all over, and that was the best part of it. And so no, at that point we did not know. And when we sat down, to say that research was not useful would be completely untrue. It was extremely useful to have had that research. It was extremely useful to have had feedback from people, but it's a completely different medium. And I think therefore, while designing, every time that you design in any space, in this case, we're talking from physical to virtual, or just straight virtual, you have to keep the medium in mind and understand the animal before you just go designing.
Yeah, because otherwise you're first restricted. Sorry, did I cut you off?
No, not at all. It's just that the attention span is very, very short.
And there's lots that is demanding, right? Because people switch between screens very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. You're gone in a flick.
It's as quickly as something refreshes. But when you're designing going forward now, do you think that we're ever going to come back to only physical? That's never going to happen. Shows now won't just be limited to.
I think that this time has provided us with an opportunity and a challenge to say we have a greater challenge to outdo ourselves. So whether it is the physical space, we need to create in a way that really gets people, really shakes you off the ground you stand. So people will come to you, because I think now information is so easily available. We're all taking so much trouble to deliver information in the comfort of someone's armchair, that for them to get up and come to something there needs to be very good reason to do that. So therefore, to say that the physical space won't exist is not accurate in my opinion. But I think it's going to be driven by excellence. The more unusual, the more arresting, the more captivating a real physical exhibit is, the more people will visit it. And it's going to be the same for the virtual space. I think it's just going to push this time, hopefully will push us all to just be the best of ourselves and put the best of what we like to say out, I think. But I'm an optimist, so that's how.
No, I think when you're looking into the future, I think optimism is something that we need right now. Do you have an interesting project in the pipeline that you can tell us about?
Yes, it's very interesting, but I haven't checked whether I'm allowed to talk about it. But, it is with Google Arts and Culture, and yes, it is very interesting, and we're very excitedly working on it.
Tell me a bit about your planning process with Google Arts and Culture, because everyone seems to be on it. We're all enjoying this. What's the process like for you?
The process, we've done so many things with Design Temple, on my own. What you realize at the end is that you need a partnership that takes care of something in the best way that they can. And the good thing with Google Arts and Culture is it's a not-for-profit.
Yeah.
And they have the technology to deliver excellence at very basic bandwidth. So somebody sitting in with very low connectivity or just average connectivity can still access the site and look at it. Now, if I were to try and even, we could have this conversation and say, I want to not do the physical space and I want to do the virtual space. And if I tried to build that platform, that virtual platform myself, it would be impossible. That kind of technology is not available. So I think that is one of the reasons why everybody's on it. The other thing is, it's like so much to choose from. If you like art or design or craft or anything related in that field, it's such a beautiful place to go to when it's got all kinds of things that are available to you, which is probably why I think a lot of us have partnered with them.
Right.
Technology being the main piece of that.
Question that we've got, which is quite interesting, because we're also talking about working things around for the audience, and perhaps this question might be a good point for all of our panelists to think about, and we'll talk about it as the conversation proceeds. How has the COVID experience shaped storytelling and experiential, even the recording aspect of art? Since you're looking at Google Art and Culture, perhaps you'd like to answer this.
I mean, like I said earlier, the point is that we have all learned that we can now deliver information to people in the comfort of their homes. And people are interested in receiving information. They may not necessarily be able to travel. In fact, with Google Arts and Culture, in our seating exhibit, we have some of the caves in Ajanta that we have referenced as some of our early seatings. Now, those caves are closed to the public. I don't mean during COVID, I mean even otherwise, because it's not safe. But these guys have gone in there and done like a 360-degree virtual tour of those caves. So that is already in their system, and that we've taken that and put it into our exhibit. And something like that is just not available to anyone. Right. So while obviously there is the safety aspect, which is that you do not need to go to a crowded place to view something, that is the most obvious aspect. But the other thing is that, of course, beyond this, things that were not available, like they've got things with things as in virtual tours that you take on the top of the minaret of a Red Fort or any monument. Now, those kind of views are not available anywhere. It's not possible for any of us to see it. So therefore, I think those are the things that make us go towards them as far as the partnership is concerned. And I think Corona is just something, I personally think it's just something that's whacked us to really get up and be mindful, to be mindful, to create consciously and create, but when I say consciously, I mean not with clutter.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for the response, and thank you to our audience who's also posting. I'm not going to strictly stick to we answer all these questions at the end of it. As they come along, we should have a conversation as if we were in the same room. But what I will do is, if these are questions that are more general, we'll take them to the end, towards the end of our chat. We have another Google Arts and Culture, and since you're with your experience of Google Arts and Culture, I'm going to ask this and then give you a breather. Will the rise of digital platforms for the consumption and distribution of arts content like Google Arts and Culture become more the norm than the exception? Do you think platforms like these can replace museums? Short answer, no. Long answer?
Yeah, short answer is definitely no. But I think that the digital virtual platforms like Google Arts and Culture are here to stay. I think that is something that everyone and anyone can access speedily. So it's definitely here to stay. But like I said, when you create something of beauty or of wonder or something that is really going to blow your mind, really, then you will go to visit it. It's the way it is. Some of my favorite shows have been at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I mean, every summer when I'm there, I may not do anything else, but I will get a ticket and I will go and see those exhibits because they're just something I can get goosebumps.
Walter Benjamin has
looking at Pink Floyd's life, and I was never into Pink Floyd, but just the way they present the story, that presentation, the engagement, it's all about engagement. And remember that what I think Corona and the COVID time has taught us is we're human beings, we need to connect. If we're finding a way to connect virtually, that's brilliant. But no, I don't think the real and the physical is going to go away. We have to just work a little bit more on engagement.
Right.
You know?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Talking about stories, engagement, real, physical, Paul, if I could bring you in. Thanks, Divya. Paul, if I could bring you in. You're someone who has been actively collecting. You're someone who also works with archives. There's the archive. There are shows that happen IRL, in real life, and then there is the space that you occupy online, and quite an engaging experience this is. How do you see stories and the experience of artwork having completely changed just now? What has happened to your collecting practice and your viewing practice?
Thanks, Aparna. I would say there are a few things here. First and foremost is, of course, this whole purpose. As far as Sarmaya is concerned, that the word Sarmaya is, collective property. So it's, conceptually what belongs to all of us. The other thing is the museum without boundaries.
Yes.
And, when we started largely in digital format way back in 2015. So we are now in our, 6th year of being a, digital space. The challenge has always been about access. Whatever we may say, 100% experience for 1% of the population versus a 90% experience for 50% of the population, I'd probably choose the latter. Once in a while, I'd give myself the liberty of enjoying that 100% experience. But if you can get to that vast majority of folks out there who never have access, then that's something we certainly must try, right? And so that's really the one big, large purpose of Sarmaya. It's about access. The second thing is to have a point of view. I think, we really want everyone to have the ability to look at, engage, and also kind of bring to bear their own points of view. So I, agree with what Divya said about the engagement part. We use the storytelling in multiple ways. So the channel that you use and the format that you tell your story in, and sometimes it's only about a beautiful visual with a short snippet, and then somebody wants to engage more, they go to another channel, which could be YouTube, it could be Facebook, it could be, we anchor ourselves largely around Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and the website.
Yes.
And what we've seen in this last 2 years of the pandemic is essentially a huge adoption of digital.
Right.
Because of the fact that we are partnering with a lot of organizations on the ground, we are finding them adopting digital even for the last mile. So, for example, one of the partners we work with very regularly is Pratham. And Pratham has clusters of 5 kids who are given a tab. And we create content for them. And that content is consumed, with great relish. So we need to, make that shift. And Corona gave us that opportunity to understand that in a very visceral sort of way, to make that shift from language and numeracy, alone, to creating a certain rootedness in our own culture. I think part of our problem currently, and I may be hung for this, is the disconnect from our own roots, right? And the more you have that, the more secure you become as a community. And
when
I think that's...
Roots, what do you mean, Paul? Because I think, we need to unpack this a little bit.
Yeah. So I personally feel that, we are so rich we are so rich in our culture, in our span of what we can call India and Indian. I myself, for example, belong to a community that migrated to Kerala from southern Turkey in a place called Sanliurfa and settled down in Kerala, right? And, we are a subgroup of Syrian Christians called the Knanaya. Now, this community, even today in Kerala, I have no problems. I'm a Malayali, I'm an Indian, and I'm a Syrian Christian, I'm a Knanaya, whatever. I have no issues with I mean, there are other parts where, who are you, where are you from, etc. are questions that I still deal with, right? Many hundreds of years after we migrated here and made this home, we still deal with some of this. So I started this project, just to give you an example, called the Isanama, where I'm working with a partner in Bhilwara, and we are trying to work on, an Eastern view of the life and times of Jesus, presented, and worked upon by miniature artists from Rajasthan. And that whole interpretation of what can an Eastern eye tell you about something which otherwise is seen as very Western, in orientation. So some of these things about perspective, tone of voice, my view of things, somebody else's view of things, we need to really understand, respect, and appreciate. So to my mind, the digital space is here to stay. I think there are some practical reasons why, because it's simply unaffordable to set up a physical. We still don't have a facilitating environment. I mean, I import stuff today when I see something lovely in London, but I am paying tons of duty and taxes and commissions all over the place. And, I don't need to be doing all of that. Similarly, a physical space, while it's nice to have, is huge burden, especially, in a city where I really don't need to provide access to the typical urban city slicker. I'm looking at providing access to the rest of the country, where people hungrily consume the stories that we have got to tell. And there's tons and tons and tons of stories. So we are a multi-genre collection. We love the process of collection because it affords us the ability to work intensively with artists. It allows us to do a little bit of, interesting collaborations and partnerships and provide some patronage. Not, we're not trying to be facetious, but at the end of the day, it's also about, giving people the security while providing them the creative liberty of creation of works, right?
I'm going to ask you to expand on that, because I was coming to patronage. I think what happens frequently is that museums are thought of as repositories, but we're also actively collecting. We have a responsibility towards documenting our present, towards intangible culture, towards also creating identity. And with the way identity politics has sort of completely taken over several conversations, museums need to be involved, and which makes patronage of art. And in a country like ours, where art and craft and artisans and these things become such a contested space and frequently marginalized as well, how do you see the role of being someone who commissions, being a patron, and then exhibiting these? Has that changed through the pandemic? What has happened, and what have you seen in the last couple of years?
Well, certainly the need for patronage has dramatically increased, simply because I think a lot of our creative folks out there have struggled with bringing stuff to market. Simple. The pandemic has curtailed access to markets big time. It has also created all kinds of hurdles in people who want to go out there, engage, and create purchase decisions which are based on conversations, dialogue, the touch and feel opportunities, etc. None of those exist, right? So there's less of that. So artists have struggled. So there's one part of patronage, which is how do you help them keep head above water? But that, I think, is an economic argument. There is the other bigger argument for me, which is the creative argument, which is, if you go to so many of our exhibitions in cities, a lot of incredibly talented people are coming and selling little lamps and, trinkets. And I'll give you one example. I work with a gentleman in a place called Dharmavaram, which is in Andhra, on leather puppets. Okay. Now, this man is nothing short of a very deep intellectual, right? He has the knowledge of multiple versions of the Ramayana. He will narrate them, you just ask him and he'll narrate. Then he'll, take you through the interpretations and how there are so many aspects to various forms of the Ramayana, the various versions of the Ramayana. And he's the man who's also making leather puppets. He's the man who's also performing. He's gone to many international locations. But if you see him on the street, you can miss him and you will see him at some of these craft exhibitions as a guy in a stall selling you some little stuff.
Sure.
But the man is an intellectual. And I think the feeling of security that he gets to be able to fully blossom creatively is the guarantee that we should provide. And that's really, to my mind, patronage. His ability to be saying the things he wants to say in the creative pursuit is the confidence that we all must try and provide somehow.
Sure. Sanjoy, I'm going to bring you in at this minute. Paul, we're not done yet with our conversation, but Sanjoy, you've also, and you've worked with artists and musicians. You're also supporting arts and craft traditions. What happens with community building and where do museums come in? Of course, you're working with several museums and and governments across the world. How do you see this, and what do you see what role does a museum play in supporting arts and craft?
Pretty much like what Paul said, Aparna. I think at the end of the day, it's about identity. It's about your tradition. It's about your culture. It's about your heritage. And as Paul said, 2,000 years ago, the Syrian Christian or the Jewish community may have come to India, but even today, there seem to be outsiders, like, for example, the new narrative that's been built up that the 1,000-year-old invasions of the Muslim invasions are still seen to be a problem. Now, if you look at community building or the purpose of the arts in a community, the purpose is threefold: push back against hatred. That's a temporary hiccup. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all, but right now it is the need of the moment.
Sure.
And how do you do that? Museums are crucibles of knowledge and information. They provide context. They give you a sense of rootedness, of culture, of heritage, of the fact that each community, religious, foreigners, or who we call foreigners, etc., have all brought a particular piece of what we see to be supposedly part of this harmonious whole. Now, when you look at, say, if you go to Bhopal and you go to the museum of the tribal museum there, which is beautifully done, they've created the context of where this piece of art or this piece of installation or this tradition or this culture belongs. So while you're viewing it in a cityscape, it presents it as it should be, transporting the tribal culture from a particular milieu into a place for people like us in the urban or in the urbane landscape to be able to deal with something which otherwise would be seen by us as alien, And like the Aboriginal people in Australia, who till 1967 were labeled as flora and fauna, and you could shoot an Aboriginal person like a kangaroo and get $500 as a reward for doing so. So,
and you have to repeat the date again so that people don't.
1967, they got the vote in 1987. And you're looking at today, you're looking at democratic traditions. So if you look at the way that in India, where every 100 kilometer, everything changes. Yes, we're the same people. Yes, we may be the same color or nearabouts the same color. Yes, of course, our religions may be different, but our very form of wearing the same one piece of, a woven cloth, what we eat, the dal, the ingredients that go into the dal, how we make the gur, how we collect everything changes. And it's important, therefore, in this time of migration, which is the reality of modern life, to be able to create opportunities for communities to gather around. In the early days, they used to gather around the totem pole. Today, in many ways, the museum becomes that place to gather, or should be. The Chaupal in Pushkar is still a place for people to come together. The Chaupal in many villages are still a place for people to come together. And those are the places must be reflective of the architecture, what Divya said, of a design. Our argument, continued argument to government today is aesthetics, architecture, like the sense of driving and having a civic sense of laws, should it only be done as a postgraduate or post-school or whatever? Isn't it part and parcel of our education process? And if it's not, shouldn't it be? In the United Kingdom, say, for example, or in America or in France, every parent on the weekend takes his or her child or ward to the museum. Every Indian parent who never would be seen dead in a museum in India is there at the V&A or the Science Museum or the Natural History Museum or MoMA or the Met with their children in tow.
Sure.
To learn what? World culture? Why is it that here we still have this very precious buildings which pretend to be these museums of our collective narrative? Which is the reason, I think, what Paul was saying, what Divya is saying, is can we look at taking this into the community? And I think digital answers part of that.
All of that.
There is a digital divide. Please remember, not everybody has bandwidth. I'm sure a lot of people here, I've already got knocked off twice. There is a digital divide, and it cannot compensate necessarily from the dialogue that you have when you come face to face with an object. You can go back and research it on this digital format because it's rich in context and content. But that feeling, when you go into the Salarjung Museum, or when you're first faced with, looking at the Madonna, or you go to Jerusalem or any of these places, or you see the Chola bronzes once you dust the dust of them in the Chennai Museum, is extraordinary.
It absolutely is. And I think that this sort of tension between the real and the physical is something that we're always going to have to contend with, because like Walter Benjamin says, every time it gets reproduced, it loses aura. But what it helps us do is to engage more deeply. But frequently, and I wonder, and I hope I can ask this of all of you rather candidly, what happens to representation? Whose stories are we telling, and how are we telling these stories? As people who are making collections, as people who are curating shows, are preserving heritage, and are taking this to the world, how are we telling these stories? And what is it that we need to keep in mind? Because we are such a diverse people, aren't we? So, Sanjoy, what are your thoughts?
Again, going back to what Paul says, context. Please remember, through millennia, the conquering generals have always told the story from their point of view. That won't change. Even as Afghanistan is being conquered again by its own people, there will be a new narrative. Similarly, in India or Indonesia or America post-Trump, the new narrative will be given. What you must always, I think the responsibility, I think the question that you're asking is, what is the responsibility of anybody involved in the arts? And the responsibility is to ensure there is context and there's perspective. If you have context and perspective, the audience can then decide what is their truth. If I see an object, if any of you look at the paintings behind me, each of you can interpret each of these paintings from your own perspective. Do we need to feed you? Not necessarily. But what we do need to do is give you context.
Right.
What we do need to allow you to do is find perspective. So that knowledge and information must be provided, and must be provided in a way, coming back again, contextually, that this was done in this period. A Picasso's Guernica, for example, can be interpreted in 5,000 or 500,000 different ways.
Yeah.
But there was a context in which Picasso painted it on the wall after the bombing of Guernica. And if you look at it, that context then in Franco's Spain becomes a major story, a narrative. Whichever way you may interpret it is different. You can read 20,000 things into, the bull there, or what is the bull saying, etc. And the historians can give you their interpretation. But what you can't take out, that it was painted in a particular time, in response to a particular issue. Like, for example, in Jamia, more recently during the CAA NRC protest that happened last 2 winters ago, or whenever, the art that came about there was incredible. Of course, it's been removed or wiped out for a reason. But say, for example, that had been preserved.
Sanjoy, but it does get preserved. It's preserved on our computers. The internet doesn't forget, right? And various perspectives.
Totally.
Yeah, because
But again, context, right, Aparna?
Yes.
Context. It taken out of context, it could be used as it has been used to spin a different story. And it has been. They've used it to say, this is the anti-national story of a particular community. But it's not, right?
No, propaganda works in a very specific way. What Sarmaya does, very, very interestingly, and Shivendra, I promise I'm going to come to you immediately after I finish this question. But what Sarmaya does is that it manages to get all these different stories and to be able to put together context, to be able to tell these stories to a wide audience and also engage with different levels. Because what happens in a museum, and as a museum curator, I was taught to write labels in a certain way. They had to be really short and simple and all of that. But in the virtual world, my audience could be, somebody's 90-year-old grandmother and a little child who's trying to do their homework online. And somewhere in that space, Sarmaya has managed to write extremely well-researched articles, extremely interesting perspectives that come from various places. Paul, how do you manage that? And what is it that you tell your team to do?
So I think, just give you an example, and, I must credit my wife and partner, Pavitra, for bringing that rigor. It's incredible. On the one hand, it seems like we are loose and open, but actually it comes from a very, very hard, rigorous, research-oriented, disciplined approach. So, for example, we just did some time back a spotlight on the Bengal presidency. And, to get under the skin of Bengal, we first, of course, talked about the many aspects of Bengal. So the politics of Bengal, the music of Bengal, the food of Bengal, the migration, about tea, all of that. Then we talked about multiple perspectives. So we had Sudeep talking about Plassey in a live session. We have William Dalrymple talking about anarchy. Pretty much about the same thing, but somewhat different perspectives.
And different archives.
So, and we actually did live walkthroughs of Calcutta. So you actually had music from all age groups and all kind of communities. So you had the balls, you had the young, people doing rap, all from Calcutta, Bengal, or the Greater Bengal Presidency, right? So one is to provide that breadth of perspective. And just like Sanjoy said, it's not for us to say, hey, this is the only view of things that you will see from us. We'll say, here is a bunch of things that you will see from us. Form your own opinion, and where you feel courage and where you feel you want to, you can add to the opinion and the perspective so that we bring on board your perspective also. And that comes through the multiple channels that we use and the multiple formats through which we convey the story. So if you want to just see it quickly, listen to a brief story and move along, that's fine. If you want to engage in the next layer of depth, you have that too. If you really want to go deep under the skin of the subject, you have that option too. So the idea is digital allows you the capacity to layer.
Right.
And layering is crucial in some of these things, because if everyone has to be overwhelmed and unusually intellectual stuff has to be thrown at people, you lose them.
Right.
You layer it. Let them choose what is the level of engagement they want. And let me assure you that if they like the basic form, they very quickly transform into liking the more intense and the more detailed and the more elaborate forms.
Sure.
But you can't lose them right in the beginning by over intellectualizing. And and I always say that some of the art shows, if you read a curator's note, you need to bring in a panel of interpreters to figure the damn thing out. So most people look at the curator's note and then walk in and see what they have to and figure what it is and go away. So our challenge always has been that you come in and you feel safe and you feel welcome through the interaction, to not get overwhelmed and want to just get the hell out of there.
Right. Thank you. And thank you, Sanjoy, for your perspective too. We're going to bring in Shivendra, who's been very quiet. And we've been so far talking about a lot of, storytelling. We're talking about, putting things in perspective and all of that. But what we haven't really spoken about so far is the actual material itself. The biggest fear that many of us, and I know that my colleagues, especially my conservator colleagues, had was, what are we going to do? Who is going to monitor these readings? What is going to happen? And I know that there are several, people kept going in. Shivendra, this must have been a complete nightmare for you the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's been actually very challenging because most of our material, you need specialists to deal with it. We have over 500 films and some very old films. I mean, and they are nitrate based, they are acetate based. So you need specialist conservators, and also your air conditioning and humidity control. Plus we have over 50,000 negatives of films ranging from the silent era right till the advent of cinema till now. So, and posters and scripts and, there's so much material. And then you have the onus of, our collection is very random. Because when we got into film preservation, you had to collect what was available. It wasn't like streamlined that, you're going to collect from the early cinema, or you're going to collect from the 60s or the 70s. So we were able to collect. More importantly, that we were holding collections of people who were giving us the collection to preserve. So we had some of the real stalwarts. You have the collections of Sohrab Modi and negatives of all his films, stills, beautiful negatives. I mean, these are, and photography at that time for films like Jhansi Ki Rani, which had the cameraman who shot Gone with the Wind, Ernest Haller, who came here and shot, and they brought the best of photographers. And if you see those negatives, and I had to figure out at a point that, and that's an interesting story because none of my conservators could come because they were living very far off. Many in Nalasopara, and that's really for people not living in Bombay. That's really 2 hours away, and how do you get them? And the cops won't allow you.
Yeah.
So I used to take a camera around my neck, hold it, and I used to walk all the way to the archive. And there was an instance where I was stopped by the cops because there was a jeep which went past me, and they stopped from a little far, and I didn't know what to do. I thought I've had it. They're going to catch hold of me. So I pulled out my driving license and I just waved it like that. And they probably thought I was pressed because I was holding, I had a couple of cameras on my thing. And I went every day walking to the archive to start my archive, the humidity and air conditioning. And even then, Aparna, we had a bit of damage. We lost some of the negatives. There was problems in that.
Right.
And so that's been a real challenge. And we've slowly now started getting our people back in and trying to damage control as much as possible. But yes, it's always a challenge during these times. And
because conservation is a contact sport. You can't you can't sit at home and curators can write and curators can do other things, but conservators need to be right there. How is it? What are we going to do for the next couple of years? Because I'm assuming that as slowly museums open, they have opened in the West, we will, we inch towards it, then we close and we go back and forth. What are the next couple of years going to be like for conservation, especially with material as delicate?
Well, I think, when you look at something what we did in 2020, we did our film preservation workshops. We do it annually every year. And 2019, we had we did the workshop with not only within India, but we had people coming in from Afghanistan, from Nepal, from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh. And what we realized was that these workshops, when we did it in 2020 on a virtual platform, I think we were struggling. We were struggling because I think like what Paul has said, what Sanjoy has said, what everybody has said, that you need a physical dialogue with the material and even the trainers, they needed that personal sort of connection, which we thought was missing on the virtual platforms. I mean, you could give lectures, you could do that, but there was so much of practical, like in terms of film preservation, in terms of photographic conservation, in terms of, film digitization, or moving on to the new technology. We're the first people to start with 8K technology, which is not even come into your movie theaters. So with Prasad, we are digitizing for the first time the 8K, and even that cannot happen unless there is a certain number of people you require. So I think it's going to be challenging with the time, but there is no other way for us than to be physically in touch with our material.
Right. So for the next, but during these workshops that happen, you take your participants through, and I was very lucky to witness the first one that happened with FICCI. You take participants through various material, through how do you handle these things. And one thing, a major takeaway that I had from there was that you can see physical degradation, but digitally things are just gone. It's poof, How are we going to manage that when we're moving into the online space completely, with such gusto?
Yeah, I mean, digital itself is a challenge for us. We talk about digital dilemma. In fact, I'm of a strong opinion. We conducted a whole lot of research of what is called digital dilemma, and I think there's a lot of belief in people that digital is here for permanency. That if you put a content onto a digital platform, it's going to be there for a very long period of time. So we ourselves are fighting that challenge because we understand that a digital is something which is being created, which sort of is constantly changing, which is you constantly need to upgrade, you constantly need to keep moving from different softwares, different hardwares. So even in terms of digital preservation, which is really a challenge, we haven't found a sustainable or a kind of a medium which celluloid had, which we can say that it lasted for over 100 years.
Right.
So even when we are moving on to digital, and everything is moving on to digital, I think in terms of films, in terms of whether it's digital projection or whether it's any of the material which is going to be on digital for people to view, I think there will be still a large part of people who will like to see the physicalities of it.
Right. While people are setting up these virtual databases, do you have a word of advice? Because you're dealing with a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, I know. I'm saying that most of the database, which is now, I'm talking purely from the film point of view. Mm-hmm. What is really sad is that most of the database which we have in India, including our Wikipedias, most of them are not accurate. We don't have a single professional proper database as far as film is concerned in terms of the history of Indian cinema is concerned. And that's been a real challenge in terms of, the dates are wrong. So there has never been that intense sort of work towards getting a great sort of work done on the database. I hope with the digital technology coming in and with the way the world is changing now, we will be able to put large part of our database, which is made accessible to a lot of number of people across the world, because that's the only way you can reach out to so many people at the same time. Yeah.
While we're talking about digital databases and making sure that history is preserved and collected, there's one thing that people can do is to create ideas and to write curatorial notes and make very, very ambitious plans. And you've been working on a very interesting project. You know where this is going.
Yeah, no, actually, we were working on that, and again, it was one of the most beautiful. It was one of my dreams to have a museum.
So let's show them a picture. One of
Yeah. So we had an incredible team of Eka and Vertex, and actually this is the work of Aparna and from our team, and we were going to create a museum on Ray. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, with the COVID coming in, with lots of other complications, we were all set to launch somewhere around June, July, and now it's sort of got delayed. And this is one of our dreams, to have a museum on India's greatest filmmaker.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the museum is going to be like when it does?
Yeah. So Aparna, it's a bit of a difficult challenge at this moment because what it was what it was supposed to be. Mm-hmm. It was one is that the space given to us wasn't that large enough,
right?
And we were dealing with the life and works of Satyajit Ray, mm-hmm. And so we were still in that period of physically examining the mm-hmm. material we were going to get from the family and from producers and from lots of other people around who were involved with the film. And but we wanted a very interactive museum,
right?
Also to have a strong presence on the virtual side of it, mm-hmm. Which doesn't mean that you could access the museum through your mobiles or your laptop, but there could be some things which you could come there and then take it away with you.
Sure.
So we were trying. I think Sanjay has spoken about that, which is quite interesting. He said about that you engage with that image and then you take back with you and you do your further research. And I think that was what we had in mind, that we want to make something which is for you to physically see. Mm. And I can give you an example. I don't know how many of you have seen that they have put up Ray's one of his films, his storyboards, his scripts online, which is Gopi Gayan Bagabai, which is one of his most successful films. And that's completely online. I mean, that's the whole work progress is online. But when I saw that, I still missed seeing the actual, pages of the scripts, his handwriting, his detailing, which having seen the actual thing, you miss that on the virtual platform. It just becomes, you just scroll through it, you realize it, but there's something which is there with the real object. And that is what we were hoping to create, was a home for Ray. And, we have worked so hard on it. And I don't know, these are projects which the government decides, and all of us know the reasons of what happened in Bengal and where it's headed.
Inshallah, together, it may take a little while, but I'm sure I'm sure it's going to come to being, and we'll all enjoy it.
It's very complicated now. It's very complicated because there's a tussle between the state and the center who wants to do it. So who wants to own Ray? That's the main thing.
Ray belongs to all of us. So hopefully this is going to...
but that I don't think they think that.
Well, these are challenges. I think that that also, of course, any major project face, and I think frequently, and thank you very much for candidly talking about it, because so many times a lot of these conversations happen and nobody really understands, and people who visit these museums don't quite realize the kind of moving and shaking, the amount of negotiation, and this is before a museum is actually formed, right? And the kind of work that goes in even before, while it's just
because one of the biggest challenges for us was just convincing the family itself, and that's been the biggest challenge as far as having a film archive. It's never the public which is a problem. It's never the audience which is a problem for us. It's always been the people who have that material, because they're always thinking that how they could, and in our case, most of the material is virtually gone, or they're going. And when you see that, your heart sort of goes, and you really want to do something about it, and there's very little you can do. So it's always difficult to convince the family. It's difficult to convince them that what can a museum do rather than just hoarding it, keeping it. So those are the challenges we work constantly with.
Because this thank you, and absolutely, I mean, the idea that museums will hoard, they don't share, the virtual world has changed that quite a bit, hasn't it? That we've made it back into our stores. We've also, through several online events where we share behind the scenes, where you get the curators to talk, you get conservators to talk. So what has been hidden so far, because there's not enough space, or we don't have funding, or and various constraints, those things can come out, and we can talk about them. So perhaps the virtual has some sort of has a few advantages at any rate. What we've done just now is I can see that the number of questions are going are sort of they're increasing by the minute, and I'm going to quickly go through a few of these. And then we'll come back. But okay, so Shivendra, while you're here, are there any recent this is Dr. A.P. Jairaman asking, are there any recent technological breakthroughs in artifact visualization and enhanced effects? So, okay, this might not be specifically to you, but what are we looking at for the future? How are we seeing the future of arts workspaces in the digital? Is there a future of the arts workspace digital, or will it incorporate an essential element of the digital? To all of you, in fact.
No, I can just speak about in terms of digitization and
yes, please.
In terms of how things are changing in that, in terms of film content, which is that it's. I mean, right now, when you go to let me explain. I agree with Paul that sometimes the curators seem to write stuff. Then you walk into a museum and then you realize you don't understand that. So let me explain in a little more simpler way. That right now, when you go to a movie theater, or when you're watching Netflix, or you're watching Amazon, you're watching it on 4K. 4K is the resolution in what you're watching. That means these are terminologies and technology which the corporates will keep holding, and they'll keep making you change because they want you to buy. It's like your iPhone. Now, when you have a piece of celluloid, because lots of old films were made on that, and of course the new technology shoots on comparative to that. So a celluloid is able to give you a resolution of 24K. That means if you've got a celluloid film, please hold on to it, because your scanner is like a scanning. It will scan you and give you 4K today. Then you'll have to go back after a couple of years when the technology has changed. It'll give you 8K. Then you go back. It'll give you 12K, 16K, until you get 24K. But the big mistake people make is that they scan it once. They think they've got it on a hard drive or on a pen drive, and then they throw away the original content, not realizing that that's your most valuable content. So that is something which is what we are saying. If the new technology is coming, the 8K is coming in, which is what all your theaters, all your TVs, everything will change, and then you'll all be forced to buy new technology. So, that's going to constantly
change. And while
change.
you can buy new technology, you can't replace your original, the material needs.
No, that's the thing. The 4K cannot get upgraded to 8K. That's how it works. If the 4K cannot get upgraded to 8K, it just cannot be. So you have to go back. And that is why the whole terminology in digital is that the old sort of gives way to the new one. And that's how they keep you working on that. You can keep it with you, but it will not be able to compatible with all your systems. There are codes, there are various ways. And that is why on digital preservation also, there are certain kind of gadgets which you have to preserve it in. And they become extinct. The machines become extinct. So this is a constant consumer market, really. And that is why I'm a big fan of celluloid, or even films. That celluloid, way back in 1895, 1896, you can still scan that same film, and it's been over 130 years. It's still there.
Wow. Absolutely. Thank you for that. When the pandemic hit, JLF took off online, and we had some very interesting conversations. And then when it was time for the JLF to happen, and I was feeling terribly sad because I was in Jaipur, I lived there at that point, and the high point of my social calendar didn't exist. But then you logged on to a website. And Sanjoy, how did that pivot happen? You had an entire, you turned real JLF, physical JLF into a virtual JLF? With the lawns and the Darbar Hall. What you didn't manage to get on there were the annoying selfie takers.
Just before I just wanted to react to something that Shivendra and Paul and Divya said earlier. We're talking about, so a museum is obviously a receptacle for, an item, a product, a culture, a tradition, a artifact, or whatever. And then we're talking about 4K and 16K, and we've been talking about how, as innovations sort of come into being, we will have different platforms on which to showcase this. First in a museum, now online, then whatever. One of the crucial aspects of this is the content. Content is king. And I think everybody has spoken about that.
Yeah.
So when we talk about anything to do with museums, art, culture, tradition, etc., the narrative or the story behind that particular object, whether it's the recollection that Shivendra talked about, whether it's what Paul has been talking about, or Divya's, behind the throne or stories, that is the crucial aspect. And therein lies the trick, right? When you go into a museum which has got great content, Chola bronzes, for example, in Chennai, despite the dust covering on it, it may have changed in recent times. When I first went, the guy came on a cycle rickshaw on a cycle from the main guy, unlocked the door and showed me, the collection, which I had seen at the RSA, where each of the 26 pieces was seen to be the sort of crown jewel. And I think much of what we need to, again, go back to when we're talking about anything to do with museums is content is key. And therefore, curation is key. And therefore, the curator's vision or the collector's vision or the gallerist's vision is the key.
So
Then it's a question of how do you take that, like I said, and place it in context and place it in a design. And coming to your question, Aparna, absolutely, we were clear that by the time the Jaipur Literature Festival, which 2021 came around, everybody was Zoom fatigued, including us. We had been running JLF Brave New World, we were running JLF What's the Bridges, we'd been running Meta, we'd been doing everything online, and we were like sick to death of coming into this format. So we said, how can we break that? So we created the 3D experience where anybody who landed on our microsite, and of course you could choose to not land on the microsite, which you could do later and just view the episode straight. You were experienced coming through the Diggy Palace or the Diggy Haveli wall, and you chose, you want to go to the front lawn, you want to go to Mughal tent, you wanted to go to the Darbar Hall. And we made the effort to go there and shoot our pieces to camera, which were the introductions to the session, against the backdrop of built heritage, which is the reason why people began coming to Jaipur to begin with. Because we looked at combining art and culture with built heritage to be able to create value, as you know, was done with whether it's the Udaipur Palace or the Jodhpur Fort or the Agra Fort, where immediately when you come in and you see the context, and then you see the paintings, even if they are facsimiles of the original, you know you're watching it in a context and you're watching it in an atmosphere. So how in this digital world can we create an atmosphere which tugs at your heartstring and says, oh gosh, I wish I was there in person? Because remember, our effort was not just to grow our audiences and give what they were used to. Our effort was also to market what we have created as a brand, which is the color, the excitement, and the selfie people. And those people who come to, have the pizzas and have the chai and not necessarily come to a session. Why? Because our belief has always been you can come for whatever you want to. If you accidentally stumble upon something, that gives you an idea which you take away with you, which transforms the way that you think, which is what museums and collections do.
Absolutely.
They place it in context, which is the reason why it's so vital, irrespective of who is in, the new general in charge, to be able to conserve and preserve, and again I'm saying, place in context, the history which creates the collective narrative of a people, a race, a village, a tribe, and each one of us, whether we moved from our village in deep south to a Delhi or to a Bombay or to a San Francisco or to the Bay Area or South San Jose, you take a piece of your narrative with you.
This is very interesting that you say you take a piece of your narrative with you. Someone very interestingly asked, and it's an anonymous question. There are museums with bizarre agendas and quirks, like the Museum of Ramen in Japan. Someone's getting hungry now. For example, will this proliferate? Will this proliferate? Sorry, I need coffee now. Strange museums, different interests. Do you think that the virtual space is where all of these will happen because physical spaces are prohibitive? And at some point, I think Sanjoy in our last conversation also said that the days of the big museums are over. It's now about small community-based things. So do you see that there will be, and perhaps Paul, you can also chip into this. Do you think that smaller interests will get targeted? And is that the way forward?
I think, the straightforward and simple answer is, of course, but I would also say that it is facilitated by the digital world, because digital allows you to take small bites of various things and present it in a cost-effective manner. So if I have to now set up a physical ramen museum, I have to be seriously concerned about footfall, the economics of it, etc. I'm less concerned when I'm in the digital space about some of these things. It's not that it's cheap, like Shivi said, that, all of these things cost money. Collection management systems can cost a lot of money. Storage can cost a lot of money. Conservation can cost a lot of money. Storytelling, and any hybrid version of the physical and the, virtual, everything is money, right?
Right.
But I think what happens is, for at least Sarmaya, it gives us the flexibility to do some of these things on a constant, basis, including sometimes, as we are doing right now with the exhibition at Turk, right? So there are many people and partners who are happy to join us in the process of the storytelling.
Sure.
And it keeps us a little more fleet-footed and gives us the liberty to move around and tell our stories from different, spaces.
Yeah.
Maybe someday I will go, get convinced that I really need to go back to a physical museum. But for now, I think the joy of being wherever the story needs to be told is just a much happier place to be in.
Paul and Divya, perhaps you can also take this one, and of course Sanjoy and Shivendra too. Lalita Ramdas has asked, it's living in a rural area, problems of connectivity, general lack of facilities, leave museums alone, artifacts, history, etc. How do we begin to turn the spotlight on, reaching out to those who are on the other side of digital, economic and social divide? Access to and building an understanding of heritage to those in large numbers who live in that other world. That this is actually quite crucial, because we're talking about accessibility and inclusivity. Frequently for museums, it means build ramps, build accessible loos, but we're not there yet where we think about social inclusivity. So how does that happen? Yes, Paul, please.
So one of the things I can, so I wear another hat, and that's working for a foundation which, reaches out to children. So we've got about 250,000 kids we reach out to across 7 or 8 states in the country. When the pandemic happened, the last mile issue was stark.
Yeah.
So there was about 50% who didn't have access to any device. The other 50 had roughly half, capable with a smartphone, which the parents owned, and some had access to a regular phone.
Sure.
Now, one of the things that has happened is that it's forced us to reimagine how we communicate. Okay, so one was push, one was a little more engaging, and we recognize that there has been a loss of learning in wide swathes of the community. But does that still depress you to a point where you're frozen and won't take any action? The answer is you cannot.
Right.
You have to make whatever happen with whatever you have.
Sure.
So we are trying things like a traveling museum, where the thing is today you either work with the technology that is available, or you find ways of taking interesting and advanced technology to places where technology doesn't exist. And the traveling museum is one such experiment where we have a space, and we set it up in a village. Kids come, they see this, they engage. It's a short-term engagement, and then we move on. But it still gives them something to work with.
Yes.
So I think some of these things are evolving, and access, I think, will progressively increase. For example, in this particular case, in the villages where kids didn't have access, in fact, it got worse as pandemic was settling down, because parents would pick up the phone and go off to work. And so we had to rewire to say that we'll engage only in the evenings and in the mornings, right? And in some places, we are now putting Wi-Fi enabled televisions in the temple courtyard or in the panchayat office, and getting kids there to engage with content. But it's still linear. It's lot less than what we had before. But it's something, right? Rather than lose them totally.
I can see Asad has appeared, and I also have an eye. We've got 5 minutes to go. I know, Asad, I know. I'm going to so we've also answered several of our questions before. So if I don't pick up your answers, it's because through your questions, it's because through this conversation, we've addressed them in part. There are two things that we haven't quite addressed so far, and I'm going to ask you the first of these is what happens to natural heritage when we're thinking about museums and the future, because that's super important. So anonymous attendee, thank you for asking. Well, while we talk about tangible collections and heritage museums, do we give equal importance to intangibles and natural heritage? Given these are depleting assets to our biodiversity, how do we conserve them, and where does that conversation happen? Divya.
I mean, I think it's a lot we've been talking about, and I just, in a sentence, to me, the digital world is just allowing us to do things that the physical world hasn't allowed us to do. So should one be doing certain things? Of course, there is so much potential. I think we are just a sampling of people brought together for this panel. There are so many more people out there doing other different things, and it's not to say that only these subjects should be talked about, the ones that perhaps we are covering, design, film. So yes, I think there's a lot of material out there. And I want to answer the previous question about the bandwidth and inclusivity. The idea at any given point for any human being is to do better than what they have. And so if the physical world allowed us to reach X number of people, and the digital world allows us to meet 100x people, it still does not solve the entire purpose or the entire objective that we would like to achieve. But if it at least takes us a
step closer.
Yes, a couple of steps further, I think that's the objective. That's the point. And should one do more? Yes, of course, and one will. So similarly, for subject matter, I think there's so much stuff out there, so much interesting stuff, so much about Indian heritage, culture, nature,
and of course also technology upgrades that will happen, so that all of that will work.
Who sent the question should quickly put together a little proposal on what they'd like to do and send it out to the four people on this panel. And I think we can definitely try and do something. I think that's something concrete right there.
Aparna, I just wanted to add to what Paul and Divya and Shivendra said. One of the things that we've been suggesting to government is that, say, for example, take any village in this country, and that if every village, one area, community space, an existing village heart of a place is preserved and conserved, as they do in the Northeast, where the central space is conserved and preserved by the tribal elders as the main community place, and make that the environment of the village museum.
Right.
Train people to be able to record the stories of the villagers there, looking at issues of agrarian issues, water issues. So not just about tradition and caste and culture, etc., but all of the environmental issues that Auntie Lolly just asked about. You make that in many ways, it can be a digital archive, but most importantly, it needs to be a living archive around a tree and around a habitation. And that then becomes, in many ways, a sort of place, like in other parts of the world, a place that contributes to the local economy. You have a little craft shop, you start developing the craft, you train the young kids, etc., initially to be the guides that take you around, they tell you the stories, etc. And this is not a new concept. I mean,
pop-up museums have happened, community museums.
I'm offering it as, it's not a new thought, and it's happened, whether it's in Dharavi, etc., you can see it. And it's immediately, especially in today's time and age, it sort of will kickstart demand for a very little amount of money.
this will also be the space. Someone's asked about partition museums, museums that address trauma. This will also be the space where we hold on to our lived experiences. There are lots of interesting questions. There are too many things. And if I don't wrap this conversation up, Asad won't talk to me again. But there are 3 things that I would like to say, and I'm going to, in one sentence. One is that access inclusivity is really helped by our online sphere, and we need to take the fact that there are so many audiences, put that together as we approach the future. We have to also think about collaborations, because when you look at all of their practices and practices of successful groups everywhere, collaboration seems to come out as key. The final thing that I want to say is that while we're putting museums up, we also need to think about open access and spaces like GLAM and things that Heritage Lab does, and also let museums be spaces that share joy and have a laugh, and bring us together in that sense. And I'm going to leave you with Bernie Sanders by saying that all of us are really waiting for museums to open, for us to go back to work, and for us to really do great things together, because museum is where all of us can come together. That is it. Asad, over to you.
Thank you to our speakers and to Aparna for so skillfully moderating the session. Sorry, I wasn't giving you any dirty looks. I was lapping it all up.
Thank you.
When you talked about collaborators on this panel, are 4 of Avid's collaborators who I worked with over the years. I actually had listed out the projects we worked with, but there is no time. But thank you all for being here. Thank you for supporting us. We are running out of time, so I'm not going to go into details. But thank you to FICCI. Unfortunately, Dilip could not be there. Vika, Sanjoy, Lena, and to our audiences for tuning in. These conversations are so important. And if it wasn't for this wonderful audience that we keep getting, despite what people say about digital fatigue, I'm really, truly blessed that we have people come and enjoy our conversations, and also take part in it in the digital world later on YouTube. That said, please stay tuned for our next programs. As you know, we stalk you all weekly, if not more. Our next program is next Wednesday. And until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Good night.